Frank Holden, a 72-year-old Montana rancher, guided his horse along the eastern fence line of the Broken Spoke Ranch. The spring sky stretched blue above his weathered face, a welcome change after 3 days of heavy rain. His once broad shoulders had narrowed with age, but decades of ranch work had kept his hands strong and calloused. "Come on, Rusty," Frank muttered to his chestnut quarter horse as they navigated a particularly muddy stretch. He needed to check for washouts along the property boundary, a necessary task after any significant rainfall. As they rounded the hill overlooking Blackwater Creek, Frank spotted a section of the embankment that had collapsed. He clicked his tongue, directing Rusty toward the damage area. "Damn creek's always causing trouble," he said to himself, mentally calculating how long repairs would take. Frank dismounted with a grunt, his knees protesting after the long ride. He secured Rusty to a nearby cottonwood and approached the mudslide. The creek had swollen during the rainstorm, undercutting the bank until a substantial section had given way. As he surveyed the scene, something caught his eye, a slight movement in the mud near the creek's edge. Frank squinted, wondering if it was just water seeping through the disturbed earth. Then he saw it clearly, 5 small fingers pushing to the mud, moving weakly. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Without hesitation, he scrambled down the slippery embankment, boots sinking into the mud as he made his way to protruding hand. Frank dropped to his knees and began clearing away the wet earth with his bare hands, working quickly but carefully. "Hold on," he called out, though he wasn't sure whoever was buried could hear him. "I'm getting you out." As he dug, more of the small hand became visible, then a wrist, then an arm. The skin was cold and pale, but Frank could feel a pulse, faint but present. He worked faster, his arthritic joints forgotten in the urgency of the moment. Finally, he uncovered a face, a young boy, no more than 8 or 9 years old, his features smeared with mud but his eyes fluttering open as the pressure on his chest eased. "Can you hear me, son?" Frank asked, continuing to clear the mud away. The boy coughed, spitting out dirt, and managed a weak nod. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the child whispered, his voice barely audible. "All right, Ethan, I'm Frank. I'm going to get you out of here. Just stay with me." Frank's phone was in his saddlebag, but he couldn't leave the boy to retrieve it. As he cleared more mud away, he realized the situation was more complicated than he'd initially thought. The boy was pinned beneath a fallen tree that had been carried downstream during flooding. "I need to move this tree to get you out. It's going to hurt, but I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me?" The boy's frightened eyes met Frank's. "Why, yes, sir." Frank positioned himself to leverage the tree trunk. On 3. 1, 2, 3. He heaved with all his strength, muscles straining as he lifted the waterlog with just enough for Ethan to slide free. The boy cried out in pain but managed to pull himself a few inches from the trap with Frank's help. Once clear, Frank gathered the mud-covered child in his arms and carried him up the embankment to Rusty. Frank wrapped Ethan in his jacket and an emergency blanket from his saddlebag, then called 911. As he relayed their location, he kept one arm around the trembling boy. "Help's coming," Frank assured him. "Can you tell me what happened? How'd you end up down by the creek?" "Camping with my family." "By the creek? Then the rain came. So much water. Where are your folks? Were they with you when the rain started?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "The water came so fast. Dad tried to grab me, but the current—" His voice broke off into sobs. Frank held him closer, his weathered heart aching for the child and fearing for the family he hadn't yet found. Sheriff Mike Daniels arrived with 2 deputies and paramedics. A barrel-chested man with salt and pepper hair, Mike had known Frank for over 30 years. The boy's parents could still be out there, Frank said as they watched the paramedics load Ethan into the ambulance. He said they were camping by the creek when the storm hit. Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. "We've got reports of a family, the Carters, who didn't return from a weekend camping trip. Sounds like it could be them." He pulled out a map. "Where exactly did you find the boy?" Frank pointed to the location. "About a half-mile downstream from Eagle Point. If they were camping there and got caught in the flash flood, they could be anywhere along this stretch. Mike finished. I'll call in search and rescue. As the ambulance pulled away with Ethan, Frank turned to his horse. I'm coming with you. Frank, you've done enough already. Let the professionals handle this. But Frank was already mounting Rusty. I know this land better than any of your searchers, Mike. And that boy's folks are out there somewhere. Within an hour, the banks of Blackwater Creek were swarming with emergency personnel. Frank rode with Deputy Jessica Navarro, a competent young officer who'd grown up in the county. Mr. Holden, the boy's parents are David and Melissa Carter. Jessica informed him. They have another child, a 6-year-old girl named Hannah. Frank's chest tightened at the news. Not just the parents, but another child, too. They combed through the underbrush along the creek, calling out names and listening for responses. The creek had receded since the storm, leaving behind debris, broken branches, garbage, and occasionally personal items that had been swept away. Look, Jessica said, pointing to a bright red object caught in some branches. It was a child's backpack. Frank retrieved it from the water. Inside were clothes, a stuffed rabbit, and a water bottle with the name Hannah written in marker. This is the little girl's, he said. They can't be far. As the afternoon wore on, more items were discovered. A camping lantern, a waterlogged sleeping bag, fragments of a tent, the pieces of the family's life scattered along the creek like breadcrumbs. Frank was checking a tangle of driftwood when he heard a shout from upstream. A search and rescue volunteer was standing on a sandbar, waving his arms. As they approached, Frank saw what had caught the man's attention, a blue tarp caught on a fallen tree, and beneath it movement. Together with the volunteer and Jessica, he pulled aside the tarp to reveal a woman lying on her side, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Mrs. Carter? Jessica asked, kneeling beside her. Yes. Melissa, the woman confirmed, eyes wide with fear and hope. My children. Have you found my children? We found your son, Ethan, Frank told her. He's safe, on his way to the hospital. Tears streamed down Melissa's face. Thank God. And Hannah? My husband. We're still looking for them. Can you tell us what happened? As paramedics were called, Melissa explained how their camping trip had turned into a nightmare when the creek rose rapidly during the night. They'd tried to evacuate, but the current had swept Ethan away. David had gone after him, carrying Hannah, while Melissa followed but fell and injured her leg. David would never stop looking for Ethan, she said, clutching Frank's hand. He'd keep going downstream, following the current. Then that's where we'll look, Frank said determinedly. As Melissa was evacuated, the search teams pushed further downstream. The shadows were growing long, and Frank knew they were racing against both the coming darkness and time itself. They'd gone another half-mile when one of the search dogs alerted, pulling its handler toward a steep embankment. Following the dog through dense vegetation, they found a man huddled against the embankment in a crude shelter made of branches and mud, holding a small child wrapped in a dirty jacket. Mr. Carter? Jessica called. The man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Yes, he rasped. Please, my daughter needs help. She's very cold. Frank approached slowly. Mr. Carter, I'm Frank Holden. Your boy Ethan is safe. We found him this morning. Your wife Melissa is also safe, on her way to the hospital. David Carter's face crumpled with relief. They're alive? Both of them. Yes, sir, Frank confirmed. And now we've found you and Hannah, too. You're all going to be all right. David explained how he'd followed the creek, searching for Ethan, until Hannah had become too weak to continue. He'd built a shelter to protect her from the elements, leaving only to look for food and continue searching for his son. I couldn't find him, David said, his voice breaking. I failed him. Frank placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. You didn't fail anyone. You kept Hannah alive, and now your whole family's going to be reunited. News traveled fast in Clearwater County. By the next morning, the story of the Carter family and the old rancher who'd found them had spread throughout the area. Frank visited the hospital, uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to check on the family. Room 215 was crowded. Melissa was in the bed nearest the window, her leg in a cast. Ethan sat beside her, looking remarkably recovered. David occupied the second bed, and four in his arm, with little Hannah curled up asleep next to him. When Frank entered, Ethan jumped up. "Mr. Frank." David extended his hand. "Mr. Holden, I don't think I properly thanked you yesterday." Frank shook his hand, embarrassed. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone," Melissa said softly. "It was you. You found our son when no one else even knew he was missing." Over the next few days, the community rallied around the Carters. Maggie's Place Diner announced a benefit dinner, with all proceeds going to the family. The elementary school organized a card-making drive. The local news interviewed Frank, who downplayed his role despite the reporters' attempts to paint him as heroic. "The real heroes are those kids, surviving out there for days, and their parents who never stopped trying to keep them safe," he insisted. 2 weeks after the rescue, David approached Frank at the benefit dinner. "We've been thinking about what happens next. The doctors say Melissa and I will need several weeks of recovery before we can return to work. We can't afford an extended hotel stay, and our apartment in Bozeman is a third-floor walk-up. Impossible with Melissa's leg." Frank nodded, seeing where this was heading. "You need a place to stay. Several people have offered spare rooms, but with 4 of us..." David trailed off, clearly uncomfortable asking for help. Frank thought about the empty foreman's cottage on his ranch. It had been used for storage since his former foreman moved to Arizona 5 years earlier. "It needs some work," Frank said slowly, "but it's all on one level. Might suit your needs while you recover." The relief on David's face was immediate. "We can help around the ranch, once we're able. Ethan's already talking about wanting to learn to ride horses." "It would just be temporary," Melissa added, overhearing as she approached on her crutches. "Until we're back on our feet." Frank looked at the family, battered but unbroken, and made a decision that surprised even himself. "The cottage is yours for as long as you need it," he said. "We can move some things around tomorrow, make it habitable." What Frank didn't say was how empty the ranch house had felt upon his return after the rescue, how the silence he'd always appreciated now seemed to emphasize his solitude in a way it hadn't before. The foreman's cottage required more work than Frank had anticipated. The roof leaked, mice had chewed through wiring, and the plumbing groaned alarmingly when tested. Word spread about his project, and soon a rotating crew of volunteers appeared at the ranch each morning. Electricians, plumbers, carpenters, and handymen, many of whom Frank barely knew but who showed up with tools and materials, refusing payment. "Consider it community service," Joe Blackfoot, a retired electrician, told him. "Besides, my grandson's in Ethan's class. Could have been him caught in that flood." By the time the Carters were discharged from the hospital, the cottage had been transformed. Women from town had contributed furniture, kitchenware, and linens. The local elementary school had sent books and games for the children. Frank stood awkwardly on the porch as Miguel drove the family up from town. He'd never been good at welcomes, having lived alone since his wife Sarah passed 15 years earlier. "We can't thank you enough," Melissa said as Miguel helped her to her crutches. "It's nothing fancy," Frank said, leading them inside, "but it should do while you recover." Ethan and Hannah explored with boundless energy, exclaiming over the bunk beds in the smaller bedroom and the box of toys in the corner. "This is far more than we expected," David said, taking in the freshly painted walls and new curtains. "We can't possibly repay all this." Frank shrugged. Nobody's asking for repayment. Over the following weeks, the Carters settled into a routine at the ranch. David's strength returned quickly, and he began helping with light chores. Melissa coordinated with her hospital in Bozeman to take medical leave, using the time to catch up on paperwork from the cottage's small second bedroom. The children adapted to ranch life with remarkable enthusiasm. Ethan shadowed Frank whenever possible, asking endless questions about the cattle, the horses, the equipment. "Why do you check the fences every day?" he asked one morning as he rode double with Frank on Rusty. "Because cattle are escape artists," Frank explained. "They'll find any weak spot and be halfway to Canada before you notice they're gone." Teaching Ethan about ranch life gave Frank a new perspective on tasks he performed mechanically for decades. He found himself explaining the why behind each chore, why certain pastures were rested while others were grazed, why the cattle were moved to higher ground as summer approached. "You're good with him," Miguel observed one evening as they watched Ethan carefully brush down Rusty. "He listens to you." Frank grunted noncommittally, but felt a warm satisfaction. He'd never had children of his own, a lifelong regret for both him and Sarah. 1 month after moving to the ranch, David announced at dinner that he'd been offered a summer teaching position at the local high school. "It's only part-time," he explained, "but it's something, and the principal says there might be a full-time opening in the fall if we decide to stay in the area." Frank looked up in surprise. "You're thinking of staying in Clearwater?" Melissa and David exchanged glances. "We've been discussing it," Melissa admitted. "The hospital in town has an opening for a part-time nurse. But we found something here we didn't have before," David added. "A community. The kids are thriving, despite everything they've been through." Frank hired David as a part-time ranch hand, teaching him cattle management during hours he wasn't teaching. Melissa, once her cast was removed, began working at the hospital. Ethan joined 4-H and proudly showed Frank the calf he'd been assigned to raise. "Her name's Lucky," he announced, "because we're both lucky to be alive." One evening in late July, Frank sat on his porch watching sunset. David joined him, offering a glass of bourbon. "Melissa and I have been talking," David said after a companionable silence. "Our lease in Bozeman is up next month, and we need to decide whether to renew it." Frank waited, sensing there was more. "We put down roots here faster than we expected. Ethan's thriving in 4-H, Hannah's made friends at daycare, and Melissa loves the smaller hospital environment." "Sounds like you've made your decision," Frank observed. David nodded. "We have, but we need to figure out housing. The cottage has been perfect for summer, but with winter coming." Frank had been anticipating this conversation. The cottage, while adequate for warmer months, would be difficult to heat properly when Montana's notorious winter arrived. "I've been thinking about that," Frank said carefully. "The main house has 4 bedrooms upstairs that haven't been used in years. Sarah always wanted to fill them with family." He paused. "I'm getting older, David. This place is too big for one person to manage alone. I've been thinking about taking on a partner, someone younger, with kids who might want to learn the business someday." David stared at him. "Are you offering us a permanent place here?" "On the ranch." "I'm suggesting a business arrangement," Frank clarified, though they both knew it was more than that. "You'd learn ranching from me, eventually taking over more management, and the kids would have space to grow. A legacy, if they want it." That night, Frank sat alone in his kitchen, wondering if he'd overstepped. The Carters had their own lives before the flood had thrown them together. His doubts were answered the next morning, when all 4 Carters appeared at his door before breakfast. Ethan was practically bouncing with excitement, while Hannah clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit. "We want to accept your offer," David said, extending his hand. "If you're sure about this, we'd like to become part of the Broken Spoke." Relief and joy washed through Frank. "I'm sure," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Does this mean we're going to live in the big house?" Ethan asked eagerly. "It means," Frank said, kneeling to the boy's level despite his creaky knees, "that you and your family are home." 1 year after the flood, Frank and the Carters visited the spot where Ethan had been found. The area had transformed. New grass grew on the disturbed earth, wildflowers among the stones. "It looks so different now," Ethan said. Hard to believe it was the same place. Land has a memory, but it also has a way of healing itself. "Moving forward," Frank replied. "Like people," Melissa suggested, her arm linked with David's. "Exactly like people," Frank agreed. Later, Ethan thanked Frank for finding him. "Mom says things happen for a reason. Do you think that's true?" Frank considered carefully. "I think life gives us challenges, and it's what we choose to do with them that matters. The flood was terrible, but what came after, your family becoming part of the ranch, part of my life, that was a choice we all made. And a good one, I think." That evening, Sheriff Daniels brought news of another family stranded by a washed-out road. Without hesitation, the household mobilized to help. "Can I come too?" Ethan asked Frank. Looking at the boy, Frank saw not a victim, but someone who'd learned that being rescued created an obligation to help others. "Get your coat," Frank told him. We've got neighbors who need us. As they drove toward the stranded family, Frank saw the future of the Broken Spoke Ranch, a future where his legacy would continue through this family that fate and floodwaters had brought to him. The circle, broken by solitude and loss, had been made whole again in the most unexpected way.